Jonathan, I'm not ashamed of my past, because it's what made me who I am today, Lara said, lifting her head high, her eyes steady even though her voice trembled, facing the silent crowd and their probing gazes. Jonathan Wright navigated his mornings with the precision of a seasoned architect, building structure out of chaos. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the sprawling windows of his contemporary home, he found himself once again at the crossroads of ambition and fatherhood. His sleek, modern kitchen stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the scene it contained. A father flipping toast and a little girl, hair still tousled from sleep, doodling on a napkin with markers. "Dad," Joyce whined, stretching out the single syllable like a melody. "Just 5 more minutes, please?" Her blue eyes sparkled with mischief as she tried to delay the inevitable. Jonathan shook his head, suppressing a smile. "No cereal today," he declared, placing a plate in front of her with a flourish. "I made toast with your favorite jam. Let's go, Angel. We've got a big day ahead." At only 7 years old, Joyce was the cornerstone of his world, the one thing that gave his life both purpose and balance. She chattered away between bites of toast, her words like a symphony filling the quiet spaces of their home. Jonathan listened with rapt attention, nodding at her tales of playground politics and her plans to become an astronaut artist veterinarian. But beneath the surface of their morning routine lingered a shadow he couldn't entirely ignore. Tiffany. It had been 3 years since she had walked out of their lives, leaving Jonathan to pick up the pieces. Once a vibrant, loving partner, Tiffany had turned cold, detached, and eventually unfaithful. Her betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. Jonathan's once thriving architecture firm, built with years of sweat and sleepless nights, had been torn apart by her affair with his business partner, Albert. Together, they had gutted his finances and his trust. Jonathan had rebuilt his career on sheer willpower, creating a new firm that reflected his resilient spirit. But rebuilding his personal life? That was a far more complicated blueprint. Joyce was his heart, but even her innocence couldn't erase the bitterness that sometimes crept into his thoughts. "Dad?" Joyce's small voice broke through his reverie. "Are you okay?" Jonathan blinked, realizing he had been staring at the coffee pot, lost in the past. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, ruffling her hair. "Just thinking about work. Finish your breakfast or we'll be late." They piled into his car, a sleek but practical SUV that spoke of his taste for understated luxury. The drive to school was filled with more of Joyce's animated chatter, while Jonathan stole glances at her in the rearview mirror, marveling at how much she looked like her mother, minus the coldness that had crept into Tiffany's gaze in those final years. As he pulled up to the school's curb, Joyce leaned over to kiss his cheek. "Bye, Daddy. Love you." "Love you more," Jonathan replied, his voice tinged with a warmth that was both tender and unyielding. He watched her bounce up the steps to the school entrance, her ponytail swinging like a metronome. Driving to his office, Jonathan's thoughts turned to the day ahead, a high-profile pitch to a prestigious client. The project could be a game-changer for his firm, a chance to cement his comeback. But even the thrill of professional success felt hollow at times. Nights were the hardest, when the silence in the house was deafening and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jonathan, the master architect who could design award-winning buildings, struggled to construct a life that didn't feel incomplete. By the time he reached his office, Jonathan had buried the morning's melancholy under layers of focus and determination. The open-concept workspace hummed with activity as his team prepared for the pitch. His assistant, Clara, handed him a portfolio and rattled off the final details. "Mr. Wright, you're gonna crush this," she said with a confidence he didn't entirely share. Jonathan nodded, masking his apprehension with a practiced smile. "Let's hope so, Clara." But as he stepped into the conference room to meet the client, a cold wave of dread washed over him. Sitting at the far end of the table was Albert. Albert, the man who had stolen both his wife and his company, smiled with the kind of smugness that only comes from believing you've already won. Jonathan's grip tightened around the portfolio in his hand. He had faced countless challenges over the years, but this was different. This was personal. As introductions were made and the meeting began, Jonathan forced himself to focus, his mind already racing with 100 questions. Why was Albert here? And more importantly, what was he planning? He glanced at the clock, the second hand ticking away with maddening slowness. This was no longer just a business meeting. It was a battle for redemption, for the life he had worked so hard to rebuild. And Jonathan Wright wasn't about to lose. The soft hum of productivity filled Jonathan's office as he reviewed blueprints and notes, occasionally glancing at Joyce. She sat in the corner, swinging her legs back and forth while attempting to draw her version of a futuristic castle. "Dad," Joyce whined, resting her chin in her hands. "How much longer? This is so boring." "What are you doing, and where are you listening to the story?" Jonathan chuckled, not looking up from his notes. "Almost done, Angel. Why don't you keep drawing? That castle of yours is going to put my work to shame." Joyce sighed dramatically, her pencil clattering to the table. "You always say that, but I think your work is more fun. I just want to go outside." "Soon," he promised, though his tone carried the distracted air of someone who couldn't spare a moment. But soon wasn't good enough for Joyce. Her father was wrapped up in yet another meeting preparation, and she was tired of being stuck inside. Quietly, she slipped off the chair, grabbed her small bag, and tiptoed to the office door. Jonathan didn't notice. Joyce's small hand pushed the glass door open, and the world outside greeted her with a swirl of fresh air and freedom. She wandered through the bustling downtown streets, her eyes wide with curiosity. Everything seemed larger and more exciting out here than in her father's office. Her steps grew bolder, her pace quicker, as she explored the world on her own for the first time. But the excitement of her adventure quickly turned into danger. A car's horn blared loudly as Joyce, distracted by a shop window, wandered too close to the street. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. Joyce froze, her small figure illuminated by the car's headlights. Then, out of nowhere, a firm hand grabbed her arm and yanked her back to safety. The world tilted for a moment, and when she looked up, she found herself staring into the concerned eyes of a woman with a face weathered by hardship. "You need to be more careful crossing the street, little one," the woman said, her voice kind but firm. Joyce blinked up at her, still shaken. "My name's Joyce. My dad's working in that building. I just wanted to play a little." The woman smiled faintly, brushing a strand of unkempt hair from her face. "Well, Joyce, I think your dad wouldn't want you playing in the middle of the street." "I guess not," Joyce admitted, her voice small. The woman's appearance was disheveled, worn clothes, tired eyes, but her gaze was soft and protective as she knelt to Joyce's level. "Why don't we sit on that bench over there while we figure out how to get you back to him?" Joyce nodded, clutching her bag as the woman led her to a nearby bench. She felt safe beside her new friend, even though she wasn't sure why. Back in his office, Jonathan was completely unaware of the unfolding drama. He checked the time, his pen pausing mid-scribble. "Joyce?" he called out, turning toward where she had been sitting. The chair was empty. Panic surged through him as he scanned the room, then the hallway. "Joyce?" His voice grew louder, his movements more frantic. When he realized she wasn't in the immediate vicinity, his chest tightened. "Clara!" he barked at his assistant, who appeared startled by his tone. "Have you seen Joyce?" "No, sir," Clara replied, her brows furrowing with concern. Jonathan didn't wait to hear more. He bolted out of the office, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. His little girl was out there somewhere, alone. He sprinted down the sidewalk, scanning the crowd for any sign of her. His heart pounded as he called her name repeatedly, ignoring the curious stares of strangers. At that time, there was no need to be silent, left Numb Muffin in her mind. Finally, his eyes landed on a small figure sitting on a bench across the street. Relief flooded his body, but his relief quickly turned to suspicion when he saw Joyce wasn't alone. A woman sat next to her, speaking softly as Joyce nodded. Jonathan crossed the street in long, hurried strides, his protective instincts flaring. "Joyce," he called, his voice sharp with both worry and anger. Joyce looked up, startled, and waved. "Dad!" Jonathan reached them in seconds, standing tall and imposing as he fixed his gaze on the woman. "Who are you? What are you doing with my daughter?" The woman flinched at his tone but held her ground. "Your daughter almost got hit by a car," she said calmly. "I pulled her back and made sure she was safe." "Dad, don't yell," Joyce interjected, tugging on his sleeve. "This lady saved me." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his eyes dotted between his daughter and the stranger. "Is that true?" "Yes," the woman said simply. "I was walking by when I saw her in the street. She didn't seem to know the danger she was in." Jonathan exhaled deeply, his emotions caught between gratitude and residual fear. "Thank you," he said stiffly, though his tone was reluctant. "I appreciate what you did." The woman shrugged. "You don't have to thank me, just make sure she doesn't wander off again." Jonathan crouched down to Joyce's level, his hands resting on her small shoulders. "Joyce, you can't just leave like that. I was worried sick." "I'm sorry, Daddy," she murmured, her lip quivering. Jonathan softened, pulling her into a hug. "I just don't want anything to happen to you, Angel." As he held his daughter close, he glanced up at the woman again. For the first time, he really looked at her. Her clothes were threadbare, her shoes worn, but there was a quiet dignity about her that struck him. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone less accusatory. "Laura," she replied, standing up from the bench. "Well, Laura," Jonathan began, awkwardly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. Can I at least offer you something? Lunch? Coffee?" Laura hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "I don't need anything," she said. "Just take care of her." Jonathan stood, Joyce still clinging to his hand. "At least let me help you somehow. It's the least I can do." Laura shook her head, turning to leave. "I'm fine," she said simply, but her faint smile betrayed a flicker of gratitude. Jonathan watched as she disappeared into the crowd, a peculiar sense of unfinished business lingering in her wake. Joyce tugged at his hand, drawing his attention back to her. "Dad," she said quietly, "can we help her? She looks like she needs it." Jonathan stared down at his daughter, her innocent words stirring something within him. "Maybe we can, Joyce," he said softly. "Maybe we can." As they walked back to his office, Jonathan couldn't shake the image of Laura's weary but kind face. Little did he know, their paths were destined to cross again, and this time it wouldn't be by chance. Laura's unexpected re-entry into Jonathan and Joyce's lives wasn't entirely unplanned. Days after their first encounter, Jonathan found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. Her calm yet resilient demeanor, coupled with the way she had saved Joyce, left an impression. Against his usual caution, he decided to extend an offer, a way to thank her while also providing her with a chance to improve her circumstances. It started as a simple idea. Jonathan needed help around the office, and Laura could use a fresh start. She was reluctant at first, insisting she didn't want charity, but eventually she agreed, though with one condition. If I don't do well, fire me. I want to earn this. Jonathan respected her integrity, and soon, Laura became a part of his team. Though her clothes were still modest and her experience limited, Laura's work ethic and determination quickly silenced doubts. She picked up tasks with surprising efficiency and even brought a calming presence to the office, something Jonathan didn't realize had been missing. More importantly, she formed a bond with Joyce that grew stronger every day. Joyce would light up whenever Laura was around, her laughter ringing through the office as Laura indulged her with stories and little games during breaks. For a girl who had been missing a mother's nurturing presence, Laura's kindness was a balm. But not everyone welcomed Laura with open arms. Hey, Lee, Jonathan's longtime secretary, had always been fiercely loyal to him, perhaps a little too much. She had a keen eye for detail and an unyielding work ethic, but her professional veneer often hid an undercurrent of possessiveness toward her boss. To Haley, Laura's sudden arrival was an unwelcome intrusion. The easy rapport she shared with Jonathan and her growing connection with Joyce felt like threats to Haley's position, both professionally and personally. Tensions simmered beneath the surface for weeks. Laura, unaware of Haley's animosity, went about her duties with diligence and care. She managed schedules, filed paperwork, and even assisted with client presentations. Her natural warmth endeared her to others in the office, though it only deepened Haley's resentment. One afternoon, while Jonathan was away at a client meeting, Haley saw her chance to act. She approached Laura with a tight smile. "Jonathan asked me to leave these files on his desk. Could you take care of it for me? I'm running behind on another task." "Sure," Laura replied, taking the folder without hesitation. Haley's plan was set in motion. She waited until Laura left Jonathan's office, then crept inside, rearranging papers and placing a confidential document in the folder Laura had touched. Satisfied, she straightened the desk and left, already rehearsing her lines for later. The storm hit the next morning. "Laura," Jonathan called from his office, his tone unusually cold. "Can I see you for a moment?" Laura stepped inside, her heart sinking at the sight of Haley standing beside Jonathan, her arms crossed and an air of smug satisfaction on her face. "Jonathan, I left Laura alone in your office yesterday," Haley began, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "When I came back, she was looking through confidential files. I warned you about hiring her." "That's not true," Laura said firmly, her eyes narrowing. "I haven't stolen anything. I only did what Haley asked me to do." "Then how do you explain this?" Haley snapped, holding up a folder containing sensitive client documents. "These were moved around, and the only person who touched them was you." Jonathan's brow furrowed, his gaze shifting between the two women. His instincts told him something was off, but the evidence didn't look good. "Laura," he said slowly, "is there anything you want to tell me?" Laura felt a lump in her throat. She had worked tirelessly to prove herself, to rebuild her life, and now it was all crumbling around her. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "But if you don't trust me, I'd rather leave than stay where I'm not welcome." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. "Dad!" Joyce's voice cut through the tension as she ran into the room, her small face flushed with urgency. "Laura is innocent." "Joyce, sweetie, this is grown-up stuff," Jonathan began, but she interrupted him with a determination far beyond her years. "No, Dad, I saw Haley messing with the documents yesterday. She told Laura to put them on your desk, but after Laura left, Haley went in and moved everything around. She's lying." The room went silent. Haley's face paled as she stammered. "Joyce doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just a child." "I'm not lying," Joyce insisted, her eyes brimming with tears of frustration. "Laura would never do anything bad. She's my friend." Jonathan looked at his daughter, then back at Haley. The pieces clicked into place. Haley's defensiveness, Laura's unwavering honesty, and Joyce's unexpected courage painted a picture that left no room for doubt. "Haley," Jonathan said, his voice low and sharp, "is there something you want to tell me?" Haley faltered, her mask slipping. "I was just trying to protect you," she said weakly. "I thought she was going to ruin everything." "Enough!" Jonathan cut her off, his tone final. "You've crossed a line. Pack your things. You're done here." Haley's mouth opened as if to protest, but the icy determination in Jonathan's eyes silenced her. She turned and stormed out, her heels clicking against the floor like an angry metronome. As the door closed behind Haley, Jonathan turned to Laura, his expression softening. "Laura, I'm sorry. I should have trusted you from the start." Laura shook her head, though her relief was evident. "You don't have to apologize. I'm just glad the truth came out." Jonathan knelt down to Joyce's level, pulling her into a hug. "Thank you, Angel," he said softly. "You were brave to speak up." Joyce beamed, glancing at Laura. "I told you Laura wouldn't do anything bad, Dad." Jonathan straightened, meeting Laura's gaze. "You're part of this team now, Laura, and part of our family too, if you'll have us." A rare smile crossed Laura's face, the kind that hinted at the walls she was slowly letting down. "I'd like that, Jonathan," she said. And though none of them realized it yet, the bonds forged in that moment would become the foundation of something far greater, something none of them could have anticipated. The invitation arrived at Jonathan's office in an envelope so pristine it seemed to mock him. He recognized the handwriting immediately, Tiffany's elegant script, looping and poised, much like the woman herself. Inside was a gilded invitation to her wedding with Albert. The words felt like a slap across the face. "Jonathan Wright, you are cordially invited to celebrate the union of Tiffany Caldwell and Albert Grayson." Jonathan stared at the card, his jaw tightening. He knew he couldn't refuse. The event wasn't just a personal affair, but also a professional one. The guest list boasted a who's who of investors and industry giants, including Lawrence Grayson, Albert's father and a potential client for Jonathan's firm. His presence wasn't optional if he wanted to secure a future for his company. That attending alone would be humiliating. He could already picture Tiffany and Albert's smug expressions, reveling in this discomfort. That's when the idea struck him. He needed a date. No, a partner. Someone who could deflect their barbs and shield him from their thinly veiled mockery. Someone like Laura. "Laura, I need your help," Jonathan began that evening, his tone hesitant. She was in the kitchen, helping Joyce with her homework. At his words, she looked up, curious but cautious. "Sure," she said, folding her arms. "What's going on?" Jonathan hesitated, feeling uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Tiffany's getting married," he finally said, "and I've been invited. It's not just personal, it's business. There's a major investor I need to meet there. But I can't go alone, it would..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "You want me to go with you?" Laura asked, her brows furrowing. "And just go with me," Jonathan clarified. "Pretend to be my girlfriend for the day." Laura blinked, taken aback. "Jonathan, are you sure this is a good idea? I mean, me, Tiffany and Albert know who I am. They'll know this isn't real. They don't know you," Jonathan countered, his tone more earnest now. "And you're perfect for this. You're smart, kind, and grounded. I trust you, Laura. I wouldn't ask if I didn't need you." Laura looked at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, I'll help. But if this backfires, don't say I didn't warn you." The wedding was nothing short of a spectacle. Held at a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, it screamed opulence. From the crystal chandeliers to the perfectly manicured gardens. Jonathan adjusted his tie as they approached the entrance, glancing at Laura beside him. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress that Joyce had helped pick out. Despite her nerves, she carried herself with quiet grace. "Ready?" he asked softly. "As I'll ever be," Laura replied, forcing a smile. Inside, the room buzzed with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Tiffany spotted them almost immediately, her expression morphing from surprise to thinly veiled amusement. She glided over, Albert in tow, her white gown shimmering under the light. "Jonathan," she purred, her eyes darting to Laura. "You made it, and with company, I see." "This is Laura," Jonathan said evenly, "my girlfriend." Tiffany's lips curved into a saccharine smile. "Charmed, I'm sure. Jonathan, I didn't realize you'd moved on so, quickly." "Things change," Jonathan said, his tone firm but polite. Albert chuckled, shaking Jonathan's hand. Good to see you, Jonathan. You always were full of surprises." As the evening wore on, Jonathan did his best to focus on Lawrence Grayson, who seemed intrigued by his firm's work. But Tiffany and Albert's presence lingered like a shadow. Laura stayed by his side, offering quiet support, even as Tiffany's gaze grew sharper. Finally, during a lull in the evening, Tiffany struck. She raised her glass, drawing attention to herself and Laura. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice lilting with faux charm, "I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to see Jonathan here tonight with his new companion. Laura, isn't it?" Laura nodded, her jaw tightening. "I couldn't help but wonder," Tiffany continued, feigning innocence, "where you met Jonathan. It's such a small world, isn't it?" "Tiffany," Jonathan warned, his tone icy. But Tiffany pressed on, her smile widening. "I mean, it's so inspiring, isn't it? Laura's journey, I mean? From homeless shelters to high society, it's a story worthy of a movie." The room went deathly silent. Laura's cheeks flushed, and her eyes darted to Jonathan, who looked livid. "Tiffany, that's enough," Jonathan snapped, stepping forward. "You've crossed the line." But Laura's voice cut through the tension. "No, Jonathan," she said, her tone steady despite the crack in her voice. "It's fine." She turned to the crowd, standing tall despite the humiliation. "Yes, I was homeless, and yes, Jonathan gave me a chance when no one else would. I'm not ashamed of my past, because it made me who I am." Her words hung in the air, bold and unapologetic, but as the crowd murmured and Tiffany smirked, Laura's resolve faltered. She turned to Jonathan, her eyes filled with pain. "I need some air." Laura, wait, Jonathan began, but she was already gone. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. Laura's heels clicked against the pavement as she walked briskly toward the gate, her vision blurred by tears. She felt humiliated, exposed. All she had worked to rebuild felt fragile and meaningless in that moment. She didn't hear the truck until it was too late. The sound of tires screeching echoed through the night, followed by a sickening thud. The world seemed to stop as Laura's body crumpled to the ground. Jonathan burst through the doors moments later, his heart sinking at the sight. "Laura!" he yelled, sprinting toward her. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. But Jonathan barely registered the voices around him. His focus was entirely on Laura, her pale face, her still body. "Laura," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, please." Her eyelids fluttered, and she managed a faint, pained smile. "Jonathan," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "I told you this was a bad idea." "Don't talk," Jonathan said, tears streaming down his face. "Just hold on." As the sound of sirens approached, Jonathan held her hand tightly, his mind racing with regret and guilt. He had dragged her into this world, into Tiffany's cruel games, and now she was paying the price. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Tiffany, not Albert, not the investors inside. The only thing that mattered was Laura, and the desperate hope that she would survive. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of the monitors, each sound marking the fragile thread of life that tethered Laura to the world. Jonathan sat by her bedside, his face drawn and pale, his fingers gently wrapped around her motionless hand. He had been there since the moment she was admitted, refusing to leave, even when the nurses insisted he rest. "Laura," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You have to wake up. You're stronger than this." The hours after the accident had been a blur of chaos and fear. The paramedics worked swiftly, rushing Laura into surgery to address internal injuries, but the doctors could only offer cautious optimism. Now, she lay in a coma, her once lively face serene but unnervingly still. Joyce had been inconsolable when Jonathan called to explain what happened. She begged to see Laura, and Jonathan reluctantly allowed it, knowing how much Laura meant to his daughter. Joyce now sat curled in a chair by the window, clutching a stuffed animal Laura had given her. "Dad," Joyce said softly, her voice trembling. "Laura's gonna wake up, right? She promised she'd never leave us." Jonathan turned to his daughter, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face. "She's fighting, Angel. She's strong, and she knows we're here for her." 2 days later, as Jonathan kept his vigil, a man arrived at the hospital. Paul Hamilton introduced himself as a potential client, but his true purpose was far more personal. "I've been looking for Laura for years," Paul confessed, his voice trembling. "I didn't know she was with you until I heard about the accident from mutual contacts. I think she might be my daughter." Jonathan stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" Paul pulled out a worn photograph of a baby girl, her features unmistakably Laura's. "I was young, reckless, and made mistakes. Her mother and I gave her up for adoption when we couldn't care for her. I've regretted it every day since. I've searched for her for years, and now I'm almost certain Laura is that child." Jonathan was speechless. The thought of Laura being Paul's daughter felt surreal, yet there was an undeniable truth in the man's eyes. Paul continued, his tone urgent. "I want to help her, Jonathan. I've already spoken to the hospital about covering her medical expenses. She deserves the best care, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure she recovers." For the first time in days, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope. Paul's determination mirrored his own, and though the circumstances were extraordinary, he welcomed the support. That night, as Jonathan sat beside Laura's bed, he found himself speaking to her as though she could hear him. "Laura," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "you have to wake up. Your father is here, and he's been waiting for you, and so have I." He paused, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know when it happened, but you became more than just someone I work with, more than just a friend. You've changed my life, Laura. You've brought light back into it, and I can't lose you now." Joyce, who had fallen asleep earlier, stirred slightly in her chair, but Jonathan didn't notice. He leaned closer to Laura, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've given me and Joyce something I thought we'd lost forever. Please, Laura, come back to us." 3 days later, the miracle Jonathan had been praying for finally happened. Laura's fingers twitched, and her eyelids fluttered open. It was a slow, tentative awakening, but it was enough to send Jonathan bolting to his feet. "Laura!" he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. Her eyes struggled to focus, and her voice was faint as she murmured, "Jonathan." "I'm here," he said, his grip on her hand tightening. "I'm right here. You're safe." Tears blurred his vision as he called for the nurse, his heart soaring with relief. Joyce rushed to the bed, her small arms wrapping around Laura as much as they could. "Laura," Joyce cried, "you came back! I knew you would!" Laura managed a weak smile, her gaze shifting between Jonathan and Joyce. "I promised, didn't I?" As the days passed, Laura grew stronger, her recovery aided by Paul's unwavering support. She listened in quiet disbelief as Paul explained their connection, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "I didn't know where you were," Paul admitted, "but I never stopped looking, and now that I've found you, I want to make up for lost time." Laura's emotions were a storm of confusion, gratitude, and lingering disbelief. She didn't know how to process the revelation, but Paul's sincerity was undeniable. Jonathan, meanwhile, struggled with his own feelings. Watching Laura's bond with Joyce, and now with Paul, he realized how deeply she had woven herself into his life. She wasn't just someone he admired or appreciated. She was someone he loved. One evening, as Laura sat in the hospital garden, Jonathan joined her, carrying a steaming cup of tea. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, casting a warm glow over her face. How are you feeling?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Better," she said, her voice still soft but steady, "grateful mostly for you, for Joyce, for everything." Jonathan hesitated, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had to tell her how he felt. "Laura," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to say, something I should have said a long time ago." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "I love you," he said simply, "not just for what you've done for Joyce or for me, but for who you are. You've brought joy back into our lives, and I can't imagine a future without you." Laura's breath caught and tears welled in her eyes. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I feel the same way, but are you sure? I've made so many mistakes." "I don't care about your past," he interrupted gently. "You've shown me the kind of person you are now. Be the mother Joyce already thinks you are. Be the wife I've been waiting for." Her tears spilled over as she nodded, a radiant smile breaking through her uncertainty. "Yes, Jonathan, I'll be all of that and more." As they sat together, hand in hand, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a future brimming with possibility. They were no longer defined by their struggles, but by the love they had found in one another, a love strong enough to heal wounds, mend hearts, and build a family. The day Laura met her biological parents felt surreal. Paul and his wife Margaret welcomed her into their sprawling estate with open arms, their emotions a mixture of joy, relief, and guilt. The reunion was filled with stories of the past and hopes for the future, but Laura remained composed, her heart still tethered to the life she had built with Jonathan and Joyce. Paul led her through the grand home, his pride evident as he showed her pieces of family history. "All of this is yours now," he said with a wistful smile, gesturing to the photographs and heirlooms that adorned the walls. "I can never make up for the years we lost, but I want you to know you're part of this family, completely." Laura looked around, overwhelmed by the love and acceptance she hadn't anticipated, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Paul, Margaret," she began, her gaze soft but resolute. "Thank you for welcoming me. I'll visit often to get to know you better, but my life is with Jonathan and Joyce. We've built something special, and I can't walk away from that." Paul nodded, his respect for her decision evident. "I see you have chosen Jonathan and Joyce," he said warmly, "and I support your decision. You deserve happiness, Laura, wherever you find it." Back at Jonathan's home, the atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks. Joyce bounded through the living room, clutching a bouquet she had picked for Laura. "Look, Laura, I got these for you." Laura knelt, pulling the little girl into a tight hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're beautiful, just like you." Jonathan watched the scene from the doorway, his heart full. He stepped closer, his arms wrapping around both Laura and Joyce. "This is our family," he said softly, "and it's everything I ever wanted." But as their family grew stronger, Tiffany's world crumbled. Albert, whose charm had once captivated her, revealed his true nature. He drained her finances and left her for another woman, leaving Tiffany bitter and desperate. News of Jonathan's growing success and happiness with Laura only fueled her anger. One fateful evening, Tiffany showed up at Jonathan's office unannounced. She looked disheveled, a shadow of the polished woman she once was. "Jonathan," she hissed, her voice laced with venom, "you think you've won, don't you? But you'll always remember me." Jonathan remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "Tiffany, whatever this is, it's over. You made your choices, and I've made mine." Enraged, Tiffany stormed out, slamming the door behind her. She sped off into the night, tears blurring her vision as she drove recklessly through the city streets. Moments later, her car collided with a utility pole. The accident was fatal. The news of Tiffany's death reached Jonathan the next morning. Though their relationship had long been severed, the tragedy weighed heavily on him. For Joyce, the loss of her mother brought mixed emotions: confusion, sadness, and closure. Laura stepped in, comforting Joyce in ways only a mother could, solidifying her place in their family. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan, Laura, and Joyce found solace in one another. The challenges they had faced, Laura's accident, Tiffany's betrayal, and the revelations about Laura's past only strengthened their bond. One sunny afternoon, as the three of them worked in the garden together, Joyce paused and looked up at Laura. "You're my mom now, right?" she asked innocently. Laura knelt down, her hands gently cupping Joyce's face. "If that's what you want, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'd be honored to be your mom." Joyce threw her arms around Laura, and Jonathan joined them, his arms encircling both. "Oh, we're a family," he said, his voice steady and full of love. "No matter what." Their home became a place of laughter and love, a sanctuary where they could all heal and grow. Laura visited Paul and Margaret often, building a relationship with the parents she had never known. But she always returned to Jonathan and Joyce, her heart firmly rooted in the family they had created together. As time passed, the scars of the past faded, replaced by a future brimming with possibility. Laura, Jonathan, and Joyce faced each new day together, their bond unbreakable and their love unwavering. What had begun as a series of broken pieces had been rebuilt into something beautiful, something none of them would ever take for granted. And in that love, they found the family they had all been searching for.